The title is the topic. Today I'm talking about understanding arguments. Reviewing the works of Anita Sarkeesian and Jonathan McIntosh of feminist frequency for over a year, I've seen a lot of what they have to say, not only in their videos, but also in various interviews and social media such as Twitter. One of the problems I've seen with people criticizing Anita and McIntosh's arguments is that they don't necessarily understand the arguments being made. That's not to say I agree with them, but I think people should at least understand what they are getting at with their work. So I'll start off with one of the arguments Anita makes in her videos, followed by one of McIntosh's arguments. With Anita, I'll go to the Ms. Male character video where she talks about the color pink as a gender signifier.
The color coding of characters is another frequently used visual element to signify gender. Typically, the dominant color used in the design of the female variant is bright pink, although sometimes a purple or pastel palette may be used.
Anita views the color pink as a problem when it's used to identify the character as female, not when it's used as a design choice. She also explains when she views this as a problem with other gender signifiers that are used to identify the character as female.
The most commonly used gendered signifiers, or feminizing accessories, are bows, lipstick, long eyelashes, and the color pink. But there are a whole host of other design elements that, in combination, serve the same purpose. Other signifiers used to differentiate women from men are pigtails, high-heeled shoes, painted nails, pronounced makeup, especially blush and eyeshadow, midriff-bearing outfits, exaggerated breasts with exposed cleavage, and a heart motif in their design or powers.
Because this is the Ms. Male character video, she is talking about when it identifies a female version of an existing male character.
Gendered signifiers are not mandatory for the Ms. Male character trope to be in effect, but these types of stereotypical attributes do serve to mark female characters as decidedly different by virtue of their feminine presentation.
And as she said, it's not required for the Ms. Male character to be in effect, just that these gender signifiers are common associations with the trope. Anita also specifies these gender signifiers are not a problem when used as design choices on their own.
Now, just to be clear, there's no inherent problem with the color pink, makeup, bows, or high heels as design elements on their own. And of course, people of all genders may choose to wear any of them from time to time in the real world, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that either.
Now that I've explained Anita's arguments, I want to go back to Princess Peach. Now, at face value, most people would look at this and say she's decked out in pink. Obviously, Anita must have a problem with this, but that isn't necessarily the case. Now, to play devil's advocate for a moment, I'm going to explain Anita's argument. When I put Princess Peach next to Mario, even though they are from the same franchise, it's apparent she is not a Ms. Male character version of Mario. You can tell just by the design one is female and the other is male. Even if Peach's dress were colored, for instance, yellow instead of pink, you can still tell Peach is female. This is why Anita doesn't point at every video game character wearing pink and complain, because in some cases it's a design choice instead of a gender signifier. If we look at Daisy, another character from a Mario game, her dress is yellow. So pink doesn't identify Peach as female, it's just a design choice. Now that I'm done explaining Anita's argument, I'm going to start pointing out its flaws. Let's recap the clips I previously played so I can make my point.
The color coding of characters is another frequently used visual element to signify gender. Typically, the dominant color used in the design of the female variant is bright pink, although sometimes a purple or pastel palette may be used.
Now, as I've just shown, being decked out in pink isn't just a Ms. Male character problem. In fact, Anita even said it's not mandatory for the Ms. Male character to be in effect.
Gendered signifiers are not mandatory for the Ms. Male character trope to be in effect, but these types of stereotypical attributes do serve to mark female characters as decidedly different by virtue of their feminine presentation.
I'd argue that pink on female characters extends beyond just Ms. Male character. I could even go to Princess Zelda and say the same thing. Pink and purple are a common design choice for this character, even though she isn't a Ms. Male character version of Link.
Studied extensively.
So while some of Anita's critics might point at a female character in a video game that has the color pink on them and wonder why Anita isn't complaining, it's like this. If they aren't Ms. Male characters and it isn't used to identify them as female, then Anita doesn't have a problem when they are colored pink.
Now, just to be clear, there's no inherent problem with the color pink, makeup, bows, or high heels as design elements on their own.
But as I'm pointing out, Anita's arguments are a lot more difficult to understand than most people know. This is what happens when you sit around for hours on end trying to craft a master's level thesis for these tropes. Not only do you overcomplicate simple things, but you can get things ass backwards. Just to show you how backwards this all is, let's go to another character Anita complained about, Pretty Bomber from Bomberman.
Pretty Bomber is the protagonist's adversary and sometimes love interest in the Bomberman series. And just to make absolutely clear, there is no confusion about her gender. She's decked out in pink, has a giant heart attached to her head, and also throws heart-shaped bombs.
Now let's take part of that description and apply it to Princess Peach from the game Mario Sports Mix, and see how much she actually resembles the description of a Ms. Male character Anita takes issue with.
And just to make absolutely clear, there is no confusion about her gender. She's decked out in pink, has a giant heart attached to her head, and also throws heart-shaped bombs.
But this isn't a problem with Princess Peach and Anita's arguments because she is not a Ms. Male character. It is only a problem when it's a female version of a pre-existing male character.
Studied extensively.
And like with other tropes, Anita will pick and choose what does and doesn't count as part of another trope. With one trope, it's an associated convention. With another trope, they are separate tropes. Most people don't understand what Anita is getting at because she overcomplicates things. A lot of tropes versus women in video games sounds like this. This design choice is acceptable under this circumstance, but not that circumstance, except in a particular scenario when the female is framed like this. Then it's fine, except under that other circumstance over here when it frames her like this. If it isn't good enough for Anita's standards, developers will hear about it from her more zealous supporters. I've seen people imply Nintendo is a terrible company just because they made a Ms. Male version of Link. Despite Linkle's warm welcome with over 10,000 retweets and 11,500 likes, someone wrote this in an article that FemFreak retweeted. At the very least, we can take Linkle as a sign of progress in that Nintendo is being somewhat forced to address the glaring holes in their anti-fem Link logic. But while on the surface it might seem like Linkle is a cause for celebration, you might also pause to consider the fact that it's almost 2016 and we're still dealing with this horseshit. This is an article that says, as Anita Sarkeesian might point out, Linkle is a classic example of the Ms. Male character. All this says to me is Anita's videos are enough to convince her followers that despite Linkle's warm reception by Nintendo fans, Anita's more zealous supporters think what Nintendo is doing is horseshit. Now I could go on and on about this and Anita's other arguments, but now I'll turn my attention to Jonathan McIntosh and some tweets he's made about narrative transportation theory. Narrative transportation theory isn't very complicated. Basically, we let our guard down with fictional stories and end up absorbing ideas. Narrative transportation theory posits that when people lose themselves in a fictional story, their attitudes change. It links to a wiki page, so let's see what the description of this theory says. Narrative transportation theory proposes that when people lose themselves in a story, their attitudes and intentions change to reflect that story. The mental state of narrative transportation can explain the persuasive effect of stories on people, who may experience narrative transportation when certain contextual and personal preconditions are met, as Green and Brock postulate for the transportation imagery model. As a few others elaborate further, narrative transportation occurs whenever the story receiver experiences a feeling of entering a world evoked by the narrative because of empathy for the story characters and imagination of the story plot. Given the implications of stories for the persuasion of people, nothing is less innocent than a story. I think this theory implies you may take on personality traits associated with characters in a given story. While this may sound similar to cultivation theory, it isn't necessarily the same thing, and let me explain. Cultivation theory is more about how your worldview can be affected by the media you consume. A simple example would be how after the movie Jaws was released in theaters, people all of a sudden had more fears of sharks in the ocean, even if real-world statistics don't reflect an increase in shark attacks. Cultivation theory also has other factors. Going back to Jaws, it was well written, had good directing and acting. If Jaws had ended up being a terrible movie, it probably wouldn't have had the same impact on people that it did. So while the media you consume can affect you, there are a whole host of factors you have to account for. It's also a question of how much can the media you consume affect you. Now going back to narrative transportation theory, I'm going to elaborate on what McIntosh is getting at with some of his other tweets. Going back to the first tweets I showed, he said you let your guard down with fictional stories and end up absorbing ideas. That you lose yourselves in a fictional story and attitudes change. Take note, you absorb ideas and attitudes change. Gaming could be a perfect medium to help relearn values of empathy and compassion, but sadly it's most often used to promote the opposite. Relearn values of empathy and compassion, to absorb ideas and change attitudes. Meaning, Macintosh thinks the games will make people more empathetic and compassionate in the real world if they play enough of games with these themes. Violence as primary form of engagement is so normalized that I've yet to see a Bloodborne game critique that even bothers to mention it. Or as I would say, he thinks violence as the primary form of engagement is problematic, to absorb ideas and change attitudes. Meaning, he thinks that if you never use violence as the primary way to solve problems in video games, and you play enough of these games, you will use violence less in the real world to solve problems. Violence should be framed as something tragic. Even when inflicted on enemies, we should cry about the human potential that has been lost. Even if it is just some random enemy in a fictional world, violence should be framed as tragic. He wants you to have an emotional response to violence in games, to absorb ideas and change attitudes. What he thinks is if enough games are designed to draw out an emotional response from the player whenever violence is inflicted on someone, even if they are the bad guy, it will have a real-world carryover, meaning you will feel more emotional about real-world violence by playing enough video games that conform to his design philosophy. The point I'm getting at with all this is while part of Macintosh's arguments are cultivation theory, what he also believes is video games could have a significant change on people in the real world if everyone plays enough games designed with his ideological outlook. Some of the problems with this. If gaming could be a perfect medium to help relearn values of empathy and compassion, but sadly it's most often used to promote the opposite, then how come we don't see a spike in real-world violence with an increase in violent video game sales? If you really think about it, if Macintosh was 100% accurate on narrative transportation theory, then how come the real world doesn't significantly change to reflect that of video games we play? It's because for his theory to hold water, these games should also, in theory, make people more violent. Because after all, if he believes they can make people better, why don't they make people worse? And a lot of this theory derives from the fact these games are an interactive form of media. People have been saying for years, games don't make people more violent because they don't affect people that way. Yet Macintosh proposes that with enough of his changes, they will somehow magically change people into better human beings, despite the fact evidence does not support his theory that video games change people in the real world. Over the last year, I've seen this stuff pushed into the school systems with Common Core curriculum, which revolves a great deal around Anita Sarkeesian. Macintosh and Anita have their hands in various things outside of feminist frequency, such as Silver String Media, where they are advisors. Anita's videos, Tropes vs. Women in Video Games, is actually aimed at kids, as you can see from this outtake from Anita in one of her videos.
Remember, kids, you can like a piece of media, but also be critical of it at the same time.
She says, remember, kids. As in, this is who she is aiming these videos at. Kids with impressionable minds. It even says in one of her Kickstarter stretch goals, Tropes vs. Women in Video Games Classroom Curriculum. As I've pointed out previously, Jonathan McIntosh was already working with youth on analyzing media well before Tropes vs. Women in Video Games.
I'll leave you with an amazing remix created by some female youth at Real Girls during a workshop with Jonathan McIntosh.
McIntosh was already doing workshops with young people. It's obvious that he's been trying to change our culture for years with video remix. He's been doing this since 2003, when he started doing political remix videos on the Iraq War.
So I began remixing video back in 2003 when the Iraq War was beginning.
And now his focus is on video games. Despite the last few years, he's been making videos with Anita Sarkeesian where they spend months making these master's level theses where they try to make rock-solid bulletproof arguments. His work and theories have flaws. And what I'm about to describe is one of the biggest problems with Jonathan McIntosh. It doesn't matter how wrong he is about how video games could change the world. He believes so hard in what he's doing that he won't listen to reason. To people like Jonathan McIntosh, it doesn't matter how many flaws his methods have. He's a true believer in what he's doing. He also creates disciples such as Anita Sarkeesian, who spent countless hours with him critically analyzing television shows to see things the way he does. And no matter how much you try to convince his followers he may be wrong, they can't see it that way because they are now true believers in what he's doing. Now, as far as video games in specific, I don't disagree with everything Feminist Frequency says, and I don't oppose all the changes they think would make gaming better. But if Jonathan McIntosh honestly believes the world would change if the entire gaming industry adapted all of his ideological views, I think he's living in a fantasy world where believing in what he is doing is more important than knowing things will happen the way he wants them to happen. If you like this video, I have a playlist tackling Anita Sarkeesian and her work and encourage you to check it out. It also includes reviews of her Tropes vs. Women in video game series.
I get a lot of support from people who really like my videos, and they've even been used as educational tools in classrooms. Educational tools.
I leave my audience with one question.
Oh, did I win?